All right, I'm gonna just mute everyone, and when we have Q&A, you can unmute yourselves. But I'll begin. So my name is Racine Droz. Good morning, everyone. I am the co-chair for New York City VOAD. And for those that are new joining us, New York City VOAD is a coalition of nonprofit organizations in New York City, where we have a combination of nonprofits and government agencies and others that join us to work together and coordinate disaster services during times of need. So we have an amazing agenda for you guys today. We have two guest speakers that I'll introduce later on. And I also want to introduce Zach Hodgson, who is my co-chair for New York City VOAD, and also Ayo Harrington, who is our vice chair. And then I'm just going to pass it over so that Ayo can lead us through a moment of silence for 9/11.
Thank you, Racine, and welcome everyone. So on September 11th, 2001, one of the worst disasters in the history of the United States occurred, as we all know. Terrorists coordinated the hijacking of 4 commercial airlines and carried out suicide attacks against targets in the United States. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center here in New York City. And within a few hours, both the Twin Towers collapsed into the rubble, demolishing a large section of Lower Manhattan. A 3rd plane hit the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. The passengers and the crew of the 4th plane were able to fight back, but the plane was down in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Almost 30,000 people were killed on that day, and many more have died since. And today marks the 23rd anniversary of this disaster. And we would like to take a moment right now of silence to recognize those who were killed, their survivors, and our country. Thank you. I know we are all thinking about survivors today and the many ceremonies that are occurring across the country. That said, I am going to turn this part of the program over to our board member, Carol Johnson, who is going to report and announce the wonderful new board members that have joined New York City VOAD's board. Carol?
Thank you, Ayo. Good morning, everyone. This is a great day for us, in spite of the memories of what took place 23 years ago. But we are happy to announce the VOAD's new board members. We're going to ask all the new members to please turn on your cameras and give us a wave so people will know who you are. The first one is Aaron Strom. If I mispronounce your name, please correct me. He is Deputy Director of the New York State Homeowner Assistance Program at Center for New York City Neighborhoods. Angela Calabro, Share Program Director at SBP. Cole Riley, Director of Corporate Partnerships at Rethink Foods. Dario Diaz, Regional Director, Program Officer at American Red Cross. Diane Wack, Buddhist Zhu Chai. Elizabeth Romano, Senior Director for Operations at Food Bank for New York City. Farid Kadir, co-founder and executive director at Yellow Boots. Jerome Nathaniel, Director of Policy and Government Relations at City Harvest. Peter Goditis, Executive Director and CEO at New York Disaster Interfaith Services. Samira Aliva, Vice President of Senior Services at Catholic Charities, Brooklyn and Queens. Vivian O'Neill, Senior Director of Volunteer Programs at Corporate Engagement at City Meals on Wheels. And finally, Zachary Hodgson, Emergency Service Director at the Salvation Army. Let's greet our new board members.
Thank you so much, Carol, for announcing that, and thank you to all of our new and elected and re-elected board members. We're really excited for this next 2 years of what that's going to look like, and we're going to do some amazing work together. So just to pivot on to our guest speakers. So we have two amazing speakers today. We have Desiree Dillon from Feeding America, and we also have Caleb Smith from We Act. So I'm going to pass it on to Caleb. He is the Resiliency Coordinator at We Act, and he will share updates on climate-related advocacy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caleb Smith. I'm the Resiliency Coordinator at We Act. I use they, them pronouns, and my work really focuses around city and state level advocacy on how we adapt and mitigate the impacts of extreme heat and flooding. I wanted to take some time to just briefly go over a bill package that We Act and the Extreme Heat Coalition have been advancing this summer. So I can do a quick overview. Let me just dealing with my displays here. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. All right, so just really briefly, I want to preface this as the right to cooling bill package. This is sort of building on momentum that we've seen at the New York City level. Last year, we were able to support the passage of the urban forest plan, which would further the city's efforts to reach 30% canopy cover, up from we're at about 23%. And hopefully we can get that by 2030, but the law doesn't have a time-bound goal. The reason that's so important is because the most heat vulnerable neighborhoods really lack that access to green space, the cooling that trees offer, shade, all of that is really crucial to mitigating the urban heat island effect. And so now that that's in process and the Parks Department is prioritizing heat vulnerable neighborhoods for new tree plantings, we also need to think creatively about other parts of the built environment that put people at heightened risk for heat stress and heat mortality. So one of the easiest places to start is the cooling center program, because it's already meant to be an emergency program that makes public spaces available for cooling to people who don't have access to air conditioning at home. So what this bill would do is empower the Office of Emergency Management and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to set locations and number of cooling centers available with annual requirements for community outreach and evaluation of community awareness. So they would be required to report to the mayor's office and city council on a regular basis. And it would also codify the cooling center program into the city charter. Currently, it's there's no budget allocated particularly for the cooling centers. So there's only the older adult centers are contracted to be open for heat waves, but otherwise other city facilities, things like the New York Public Library System, recreation centers, they're just subject to regular business hours. And we saw several heat waves this year that proved to be a major problem. Over Juneteenth, libraries were closed. Over weekends, because of the budget cuts last year, we saw that Saturday and Sunday access were severely restricted in many locations. And this graphic here is taken from the Overheated Underserved report that the comptroller's office created. It shows like some of the most heat vulnerable neighborhoods have some of the least access to cooling centers. So East Flatbush, for example, had at the time this report was done, 2 cooling centers operating for every 100,000 residents. So you see there's a major equity gap in not being able to invest adequately in the cooling center program. And this is really important for long-term planning because yes, ideally we want people to be able to access cooling at home, but there is an on-ramp to that in terms of making energy more affordable and making sure that everyone has air conditioning or access to heat pumps. So you can see it's only going to get hotter as the decades go along. And this bill would also allow for better standardization of services, allow for NICEM to have feedback mechanisms with community members about what kind of programming they want to see in cooling centers so that there's actually a draw rather than it just being a detour because people are just desperate for a place to cool off. Cooling centers can be culturally enriching and meet the needs of community members. And we already have places to look in terms of what people have said are really important and what they want to see in cooling centers. WEACT conducted a report and audit in 2021 where they noted that it would be really helpful to have ADA compliance across a variety or as like a standard for cooling center locations, adequate wayfinding and community outreach to make sure that people are aware of the program. So these are things that would really be facilitated by this. Let's see. Yeah, I think I covered most of it there. Yeah, so I can move on to the next bill, which is the Cool Pavement Pilot. And what this would do is allow the Department of Transportation, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to choose at least 4 heat vulnerable neighborhoods as targeted areas for a pilot program for demonstrations of cool paving or pavement coating and report on findings to the city council and the mayor's office. And I mentioned trees being really useful in the toolkit to mitigating the urban heat island effect. but there are limitations to where trees can grow and where they can survive to the point of maturity, where they offer the lion's share of those cooling benefits. So this takes spaces, particularly the roadway, that are really amplifying the urban heat effect, because dark asphalt really traps radiation from the sun over the course of the day and then radiates it back out overnight, and reduces that impact by having either lighter surfaces or permeable pavement. And this is really important to have that added flexibility. There is also the multi-hazard mitigation component of this, because when we have more permeable surfaces in the cityscape, that can help reduce runoff. It can help reduce combined sewer overflow events when there's heavy rainfall in short periods of time. So that helps improve water quality in our local ecological system, as well as just making sure that, you know, our public spaces aren't being contaminated. And also because the temperatures are less subject to heat stress, they will crack less frequently, they require less maintenance. So it really would allow for more fiscally responsible spending in areas where this would be applied. So this would be a 2-year pilot project study, and the report would be due 6 months after the project conclusion. So it really creates an opportunity to transform our spaces. And then lastly, I'll close with the tenant's right to cooling. And this one is really critical because we know that access to cooling is one of the most important factors when it comes to preventing heat mortality. You see this figure from the Department of Health's heat mortality report. When folks don't have air conditioning running, or they don't have access to it at all, that is like one of the most clear determinants of whether they'll be able to endure heat waves in their apartment. And so this takes the onus off of just individuals, because we know that preventable heat deaths persist in the current system. And now landlords, where we recognize that they should provide heat in the winter in the same way, now that we're experiencing extreme humid heat on a regular basis and are now in a humid subtropical climate zone, that they should also take responsibility to offer cooling to all tenants. So in the summer months, the bill says from June 15th to September 15th, landlords would be required to provide cooling and dehumidifying devices that can sustain 78 degrees within the unit. And supervisors would make sure that, like building supervisors, would make sure that the cooling devices are installed properly to maintain this temperature in an efficient way. And there's a real equity issue that this would help address as well, because a lot of the most heat vulnerable neighborhoods are those that have been formerly redlined. And we know that Black residents die at twice the rate from heat stroke when compared to their white counterparts. And there are so many groups facing like intersectional systems of oppression that lack the ability to access cooling at home. and there are also physiological factors. Like we know seniors, for example, and like I mentioned, older adult centers are operating as cooling centers during heat emergencies, but folks that have limited mobility or may not be able to access information to get to cooling centers, or like maybe they live in East Flatbush and they have very few options, so they risk heat stress just getting to one. This would help bridge that gap and offer them cooling in their home. And it really would target the neighborhoods that have the lowest access to air conditioning, because the citywide average is estimated to be around 90%. But we know that in the most vulnerable neighborhoods, it's much lower. And just making sure I'm catching everything here. But yeah, heat really, we've seen it manifest in a similar way that COVID has, where if there are these other underlying inequities, heat only makes them more severe. So another piece about implementing this bill, landlords would have 2 years to take inventory of the apartments that don't have access to cooling, and report to the Office of Housing and Preservation Development. And then after 4 years, they would need to provide cooling devices. But there is a provision where if landlords say it's landmark housing, or they are claiming hardship, there is an opportunity for extension for compliance with the bill. So I can stop there for questions. See, I'll check the chat too.
And members, feel free to put any questions in the chat. If, let's say, you're having microphone issues or don't feel comfortable coming on the mic.
Hi all, this is Lucy Cummings from NIDIS. Hi Caleb, thank you for that terrific presentation. And for those who don't know, they're an incredible leader on this issue. So appreciate that. One of the questions I wanted to ask was about energy poverty and the cost of electricity in particular. And I know this is something that you've been thinking about. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lucy. So, and at the city level, like that's not something that the city council could directly address with this bill, but it is something that's really critical to strengthening this bill, because say this bill passes and there's no path to energy affordability for folks that fear using their air conditioning because it means that they can't pay for food or their medication, then there's still a huge gap in who's being served. So that's happening a lot at the state level. I'll share some resources in the chat, but another part of this bill that I want to mention is there's a required outreach to both landlords and tenants about the rights and responsibilities outlined in the bill. And for landlords, HPD would also make sure that everyone is linked to their regional clean energy hub, which has a ton of information directing people to affordable energy programs that match the needs of their building or their household. So there's a lot of NYSERDA programs that could help bridge the gap in terms of either reducing costs, implementing energy efficiency in a building. So those are some of the avenues at play now. There's also the Green Affordable Pre-Electrification Fund bill that's in process. We act. I have colleagues working at the state level that are in support of that, and basically that bill would create a fund of up to $200 million to help remediate health and safety hazards that need to happen before a building or a unit could access energy efficiency or weatherization that would lead the way towards electrification. And all of these things help improve conditions for cooling in the home, because we know that buildings that have a lot of cracks or they have mold, they have structural issues, create conditions that exacerbate asthma, which also compromise people's ability to stay safe during heat waves. So all of these things working together, I think are part of the path forward. And then there's also something to be said about the role of utilities and how rates are designed. And that's something that we can intervene at rate cases like intermittently. So, I mean, I'm optimistic about passing this because we are doing the work in parallel and at the same time as we're having this fight. Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to address energy poverty outside of the city level, but we need a baseline and a standard that says that everyone should have access to cooling in the home because it's critical to our survival. And I see a question from Zach. How can organizations join the Extreme Heat Coalition? I'll just put my email in the chat. We just have a conversation, learn about, you know, what the work is that you're doing, and assess what the synergies are for our mission and the work that organizations are doing. And we accept both individual contributors and organizations that are in alignment with our work. So yeah, just reach out and we can set something up to have new organizations join. And then I will also share, there's a frequently asked questions document and I'm continually updating it as I get new questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Actually, I'll just do our link tree because that has our petition in support of this bill package that goes to City Council. And we also have that frequently asked questions document amongst other things. So that's the best way to kind of track all of our resources. And I saw Racine, am I over time? I saw the hand.
Nope, you're exactly on time.
All right. All right. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Yeah, please don't hesitate to ask me any questions. It's great to know what's top of mind for people and continue to, you know, answer those questions because we really can't delay on making our built environment better equipped to deal with extreme heat. So that's my piece.
Great. Thank you so much, Caleb. If everyone can just show a reaction or just to thank Caleb for joining us. As I mentioned before, WEAC does amazing work, especially for environmental justice. So Caleb, it's always a pleasure to have you come on board and share what's happening in your world and providing resources that we can use. That's what this group is for, is information sharing and seeing how we can work together to ensure that we're supporting each other during times of need. So I'm going to just pivot over to our next guest speaker. So Desiree Dillon. So I met this amazing soul. As everyone knows, I started with Feeding America, and I was really blown away by the presentation that she provided to us in my first week. So Desiree is our Senior Director of Partner Network Services at Feeding America. And she's going to lead us through a discussion on prioritizing dignity and community-centered approaches when responding to disasters and addressing food insecurity. So I'm going to hand it over and just give us a moment to pull up her presentation. So take it away, Desiree.
Thank you, Racine. And, the day that I met Racine, it was really like we instantly connected, and she instantly asked me to join you all today, and I could not say no. I have to admit, though, when I woke up this morning and just kind of reflecting on the few moments that we have together today, it was really a moment of reflection on the day, just thinking about where we are, knowing that today is 9/11, and just reflecting on just acknowledging those lives that were lost during that horrific event. And then waking up, thinking about my family in Mississippi who's bracing for Hurricane Francine. I said I was not going to get up in a mood. So I'm coming into this space today just thinking of 3 words, and those words are resilience, purpose, and service. So before I dive in today, I want you to just join me in a moment of reflection in the chat and just share some words that are coming up for you today to help inspire us. And whatever is coming up for you, I just want to invite you to just share in the chat. Respect for all, resilience, yes, give what you can. Gratitude, absolutely. Equity, yes, helping others. All of the right words that we need to hear today. Community healing, absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you. Continue to add those words in the chat, because this won't be the last time that I ask you to share something in the chat. But I wanted to move forward and just kind of ground us a little bit. I am not a subject matter expert in disaster. I mentioned Mississippi, but I wanted to also just share that I was born and raised in Mississippi. I am coming into this space, and I'm passionate about this work because I'm a single mother, born and raised in Mississippi, of twins that are now 20 years old, and happy to say that they are thriving in this season. They are both college students. If I didn't have purpose, and if I didn't speak with passion and show up to this work with passion, it could have gone a different way. But I realized my purpose years ago when I started my food banking career at Mississippi Food Network. And you can go to the next slide, Racine. I started my food banking career in Mississippi a year after Hurricane Katrina. How many of us still remember Hurricane Katrina? At the time, I was living in Jackson, Mississippi as a single mom, and about 80 miles north of Louisiana was where I lived, in Jackson. And when I think about Hurricane Katrina, I remember losing power for about maybe 3 days. But I had to open up my home to my other relatives that were in Southwest Mississippi that experienced a lot of damage, a lot of displacement. And I had family members that came and lived with me for about a month because they were displaced. from the effects of Hurricane Katrina. And I started my food banking journey at Mississippi Food Network a year later. And I remember inheriting, at the time, I was director of agency relations. And if anybody knows anything about food rescue and food banks, when it comes to agency relations, we're the ones who hold and build those relationships with all of the volunteer partner agencies across the communities that we served in our service area. And I inherited about 400 partner agencies. About 200 of those agencies stood up and were right there, boots on the ground, to assist with disaster response after Hurricane Katrina, even a year later. So that's significant to me for a number of reasons. When I think about my journey to Feeding America, which has been about 14 years, including my food banking experience, I'm thinking about disaster relief and response experiences while I was right here within the last 2 years. I'm thinking about Jackson, Mississippi, the town that I raised my babies in and I started my journey in. I'm thinking about the water crisis, where, and it was a public health crisis around the city of Jackson, Mississippi, after the Pearl River flooded due to severe storms in the state that resulted in approximately 150,000 residents of the city being left without access to safe drinking water. The governor issued a state of emergency in the United States President Joe Biden declared a federal disaster. I still had family there who had to boil their water for months and months and months before and after this disaster. I'm also thinking about Rolling Fork, Mississippi, a town that I, frequented a lot while I was at Mississippi Food Network, a rural town that after the tornado in Rolling Fork, 1/3 of the town was left displaced, causing over $96 million in damage to an already vulnerable community. I was raised in a rural, vulnerable community. And so these are experiences that I hold near and dear to my heart because that is my home. Next slide. When I think about the connections of VOAD and Feeding America, there are several things that come up for me. Number one, we're both member organizations. In terms of Feeding America, there are 200 partner food banks and over 60,000 volunteer partner agencies that ensure that our neighbors have access to food and resources that they need to thrive. I want to talk about that volunteer piece for a minute because that's so important to not just what we do, but for what you do also. To me, volunteers are the heartbeat of what we do. And even though we have two different missions, our volunteers are the ones that make it happen. And so when I think about the month of September, I'm excited because not only is this Hunger Action Month, but it's also Disaster Preparedness Month. So there are so many different ways that our two organizations are committed and why we are all here sitting on this screen today, because we are service-oriented. We're volunteering our time, giving our resources to ensure that folks have what they need from the day-to-day to times in disaster. So it's important that we honor and make sure that we understand why these awareness opportunities connect us and how they connect us. But most importantly, when I thought about, what am I going to speak to this group about today? I thought about equity and how both organizations, even though we have different missions, our values, our beliefs, our guiding principles, and our commitments are centered in equity. Through our network charter and your anti-discrimination pledge, we are holding ourselves accountable in partnership, in collaboration, in communication, all for the purpose of centering our neighbors. So this is an exciting moment for me to sit back and reflect on how we connect in this work as it relates to disaster relief and food insecurity. So let's talk about food insecurity for a moment. As we move to the next slide, I'm reflecting on Caleb's presentation, and I just have to say, we did not practice this at all, but I'm excited to see the work that organization is doing around justice, right? Environmental justice, and why we even need cooling centers in the first place. For those of you who are working in the food insecurity space, you know as well as we know that there's a harsh reality around food insecurity. It is a symptom of root causes. And when we think about root causes, this is just an overview of about 8 root causes that speak to systemic oppression, and particularly as it relates to disaster relief. I'm thinking about climate change and infrastructure. But most importantly, what I want you to know about root causes is that it leaves our communities vulnerable. If you layer disaster on top of food insecurity, our neighbors are unable to break the ongoing cycle of survival mode, which makes them unable to thrive. So before we dive into food insecurity, it is important to understand what the root causes are. And before we dive into disaster response, it is important to understand the harm that's been caused in the communities that we're serving. And it's going to take systems change in order for us to move forward. Next slide. I want to share a little bit about Feeding America and what we're learning from our neighbors and what our commitments are. And I want to take a moment for you all to engage in the chat and just tell me what comes up for you when you think about dignity. I'm seeing agency. Yes. What else comes up for you when you think about dignity? Respect. Growth. Empathy, yes. Not only does empathy and choice come up for me, but what else comes up for me is experience. I'll share a little bit with you about our Elevating Voices report. We sought input from people facing hunger to better understand their experiences and to have their insights to inform policy recommendations to end hunger now and forever. 2 years ago, the Elevating Voices Insights report was generated from a nationally representative survey of more than 1,000 people who have received charitable food assistance and experienced food insecurity in the past 2 years. We gathered further firsthand information and context and accounts from neighbors in our very first Elevating Voices Power Summit, which was a forum co-created with people with lived experience of food insecurity for them to hear from, learn from, and forge community with each other and to share their informed views directly with federal policymakers. What we learned from that engagement was that prioritizing dignity, what that meant coming from the voices of our neighbors. And what it meant was that everyone deserves dignified access to food. When they shared with us what they meant around increasing access, Neighbor Insights reinforced that getting healthy foods remains a significant challenge. And they reiterated that food insecurity is connected to many other issues, such as cost of living, housing, and healthcare. When it comes to expanding opportunity, food security is directly tied to economic well-being. And the majority of neighbors said that inflation and rising food costs are factors impacting food insecurity. When it comes to improving health, the majority of the neighbors agreed that food is medicine and reminded us that the movement to end hunger must be rooted in improving access to nutritious food choices and meet dietary needs to prevent and manage diet-related disease. And in terms of policy recommendations, they want us to increase the amount of SNAP benefits, to fund and continue to fund the Farm Bill, to simplify the National School Lunch Program and breakfast programs, to fund state employment and training programs, and so many other initiatives that require policy change. But I want to emphasize the importance of dignity. And I want to thank you for sharing your voice in the chat in terms of what dignity means to you. And these are things that we can do at Feeding America to prioritize how we build capacity, how we support programs, how we support volunteer organizations and our food banks and our partner agencies. But it's important to also understand that none of this can happen without empathy. And I'm so glad that someone shared empathy in the chat. So let's talk a little bit about empathy and what it is and what it isn't. Next slide. This is a Merriam-Webster dictionary of what empathy is. It is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, the thoughts, and the experience of another of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So what does that mean? To me, empathy means connection. Connection to those that are experiencing disaster, that are experiencing hunger, that are victims of root causes, all of these things. It is connecting to how they feel, what they see, and gaining perspective of what they're experiencing. It is different from sympathy, which creates distance. Sympathy is understanding someone's suffering. Empathy understands how we can connect to their suffering. And finally, next slide. I was asked to provide some community-centered approaches to disaster response. But I think for me, when I think about the work that you do, and I think about the resilience, the purpose, and the service that we all provide, I consider these things as words of wisdom. When it's time for you to take action, make sure that you prioritize. And what does that mean? It means to feel the connection. It means to gain perspective, push aside your judgment, recognize emotion, and communicating that through the neighbor voice. And so what does centering the neighbor voice mean? Centering the neighbor voice is making sure that you understand the narrative of the neighbors that we serve. Make sure that you give them a platform and an opportunity to tell you what they need to thrive in times of disaster and destruction. Building trust. Before we can build trust, it is important to understand the harm that is caused in the communities that we're serving by broken promises and systemic racism and oppression. When I think about community engagement and community impact, community engagement is just step one. And that is the step that you've already taken in your role with VOAD. You have made a choice and a decision to stand up and be a part of the solutions and support and respond in times of disaster. But when I think about collective impact, it's a little deeper. It's about centering equity. It's about bringing everyone in the community together to understand a common agenda to solve a problem. And you cannot do that without empathy or equity. And finally, when I think about advocacy, which happens before and after and during disaster, it is important for us to take a public stance and take action to ensure that there is systems change when it comes to policy, when it comes to awareness, when it comes to funding in our communities. So I want to leave you with those words of wisdom. And I hope that you think about systemic oppression, how you show up in your role, whether it is through the Salvation Army or food insecurity. I want to leave these words of wisdom with you. And I also want to hold you accountable for those words that you put in the chat, because we are here, all here, regardless of our mission to serve, to be resilient, to be purposeful, and to ensure that everybody in the communities that we serve have an opportunity to thrive. So with that, I am going to, Racine, if we need to open the floor for Q&A. There's also one thing I do want to share with you. There was a link to the Elevating Voices report that I embedded in the presentation here, but I also want to put it in the chat for you to get a better understanding of what our Elevating Voices initiative is and why it's important for us to help shape our direction of the future of Feeding America. Centering neighbors' voice is critical and important to us. And I want to make sure that I share that information with you as well to read at your leisure. So with that, any questions or things that you want to share about this brief presentation today?
I would like to thank you so much for the presentation. It was excellent. And kind of making us remember that, you know, over the past several years that this organization has really worked very hard to be inclusive, to think about, you know, the plight of people of color, to include in our discussion and our leadership people that are diverse.
Yes.
And yeah, we passed a resolution for a pledge around equity and people of color some years ago, and this just, you know, is a great way to begin our new leadership in the organization, and to know that unfortunately, since we have you now, we can call on you to come back and give us more words of wisdom. Don't think this is the last time, because it's not. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much.
Anytime, anytime. Any more questions or thoughts you want to share?
Hey, Joe, we see your hand is up. You want to go off mute?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Desiree, and thanks for the link. How did or how does Feeding America plan to use the information from the report in their programming?
I will say that, you know, if you know anything about Feeding America, you know, if I could just put it in layman's terms, you know, we are the national organization of 200 food banks and 60,000 partner agencies that historically and foundationally were in our mission was food rescue, to ensure that the food that gets thrown away in the landfills, that we rescue it and make sure that we make it available to those in those communities that are in food deserts, who have to decide between paying bills or paying rent and food. You know, there's one perception of hunger, but then there's another one. You know, it's about having to survive and not having food at the end of the month, right? And so I like to think of it as feeding the line, number one. Second, shortening the line by providing, you know, SNAP assistance and supporting the Farm Bill, the TFAP program, the community, the commodity food assistance program for seniors. We, at the state level, food banks are managing those programs through the food banks and make that food accessible to partner agencies and neighbors at the end of the day. But moving forward, our focus is on ending the line. I will just share with you that we have a bold aspiration for our nation, and that is by 2030 to reduce the food insecurity rate to 5%. And we cannot do that operating the same way we've done all of these years. So it is a systems change shift within our organization to ensure that we continue to shorten the line and eventually end the line. And that is going to take movement work, which is something that we have not done historically. Before we can embark on movement work and partnering with other organizations that are doing root cause work, we have to make sure that we are talking the talk and walking the walk, and that systems change starts with us, right? So I hope during the, it is a long answer to a very important question. And so if there's anything I can do, if your organization or you want to know more information about our bold aspiration and our movement work, I want to invite you to just send me an email. Let's have a talk and connect. And I will put that in the chat as well. I see one more question around the best practices that I can share, approaches for getting feedback and input from community members. I would like for you to do some research on collective impact. And that is something that, I have just kind of leaned into this last year as I served a tenure of a rotating executive team member with Feeding America. Collective impact is an approach to solving different problems in communities. And it's bringing different folks together, from business leaders to faith leaders, to nonprofit organizations, all coming together under a common agenda to solve a problem. And so I would love for you to do some research on collective impact. If you need any resources on collective impact and common agenda, I think that is where you start. That's an opportunity also to give power back to those in those communities who are there positioned to solve those problems. And so collective impact and community engagement would be steps 1 and 2. Just some approaches and best practices to getting the neighbor voice, right? It's those right there in the communities that know what they need and what the problems are. So those would be steps 1 and 2. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Desiree. I cannot thank you enough for speaking today. This was an amazing presentation. I just want to quickly just say, for the board members, current board members, new and re-elected, if you guys can just stay at the end of this discussion so we can just have a quick meeting. I just want to put that there because I see people are hopping off the call. But Desiree, any other final questions or comments for Desiree before we conclude?
I do want to say thank you so much. This was very enlightening. It was wonderful to see and hear the presentation, Desiree, and to learn more about how you do your work and how we can actually also participate in what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And so Desiree has put her contact information in the chat, so feel free to reach out to her if you want to ask any further questions. Caleb also put in his contact information as well, so feel free to reach out to our great speakers for today. So thank you, everyone. And as we're closing out, again, this is September is hunger awareness and preparedness month. So let's just take what the lessons learned and the teachable moments from today and put it through our daily work and just pretty much hold ourselves accountable and move forward and work together in partnership. So thank you, everyone. And you have a great rest of the day. And if the board members, again, if you guys can just stay on the call. Thanks so much, everyone.